Have you ever answered one innocent question and realized your entire life had been built around the wrong answer? That was the thought that kept echoing through my mind at 2:14 on a rainy Thursday morning as I stood frozen in the doorway of my bedroom, staring at the one woman I had sworn would never become more than my roommate. Emily Carter's fingers tightened around the sleeve of an oversized sweatshirt she had borrowed from me weeks earlier, her blonde hair falling loosely over one shoulder, her green eyes filled with equal parts fear and determination. She took one slow breath before whispering, "Can I ask you something crazy?" I had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking. I had stared down hostile investors, aggressive competitors, and reporters eager to watch me fail. None of them had ever frightened me the way those 7 words did. Something inside me knew that if I let Emily finish her question, there would be no returning to the carefully controlled life I had spent more than 20 years building. Looking back now, I realize the story didn't begin that rainy night. It began 6 weeks earlier, on an afternoon when every business magazine in America was calling me the most powerful woman in finance. My name is Claire Bennett. At 43, I owned more companies than I had close friends. Television hosts described me as brilliant, disciplined, and impossible to read. Headlines called me America's youngest self-made billionaire CEO. My board admired my judgment. My employees respected my standards. My competitors feared my patience. People assumed success must feel warm. They were wrong. Success echoed. Every evening my private elevator opened directly into a penthouse overlooking Manhattan, and every evening the silence greeted me before anyone else could. The marble floors reflected the city lights. The walls displayed paintings worth more than most houses. Fresh flowers arrived every Monday without fail because my assistant knew I always forgot to order them myself. Everything looked alive except the woman living there. I had learned long ago that trust was the most expensive luxury money could never guarantee. People smiled differently when they discovered my last name. Invitations became opportunities. Compliments became negotiations. Even kindness often came with invisible terms hidden beneath polished words. So I built rules instead of relationships. Rules never disappointed you. They simply existed. That Thursday afternoon, just as I finished reviewing documents for another merger, my executive assistant, Natalie, appeared outside my office carrying a tablet instead of her usual notebook. She hesitated, which immediately caught my attention because Natalie almost never hesitated. "Claire," she said carefully, "I just received a call from someone who says she knows you personally." I looked up from the contract. "Who?" Natalie glanced at the screen before answering. "Emily Carter." The name landed somewhere deep inside memories I hadn't visited in years. Before I could ask another question, Natalie quietly added, "She says she doesn't need money. She just needs somewhere to stay for a little while." For a moment, I did not answer Natalie because the name alone had pulled me backward nearly 10 years. Emily Carter had once been the younger sister of one of my closest friends in graduate school, always smiling, always carrying a sketchbook, always able to make an unfamiliar room feel strangely comfortable. Life had taken us in different directions after graduation. I built companies. She built beautiful spaces. We exchanged the occasional holiday message, congratulated each other on promotions, and quietly disappeared into adulthood. I had not expected her name to appear in my office on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. "Put her through," I finally said. A few seconds later, her voice came through my speaker, softer than I remembered but unmistakably hers. "Hi, Claire." "Emily." There was a brief silence before she laughed nervously. "I was hoping you would still recognize my voice. I remember important details." "That sounds exactly like something you would say." I leaned back in my chair, surprised by how easily the conversation settled into a familiar rhythm. "Natalie mentioned you needed a place to stay." Emily exhaled slowly. "My apartment building had a major plumbing failure 3 days ago. Everything is being repaired, but my insurance company says it could take several weeks before I can move back in." She paused before adding, "And my engagement ended about a month ago, so staying with family is becoming a little complicated." I did not ask why. Experience had taught me that people revealed difficult truths when they were ready, not when someone demanded answers. How long do you need? Maybe 30 days. Less if I get lucky. I looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind my desk. The city stretched endlessly beneath gray clouds, millions of people packed together while somehow managing to feel completely alone. My penthouse had 4 bedrooms. 3 of them had not been used in years. You can stay with me, I heard myself say before I had fully considered the decision. Emily became very quiet. Claire, are you sure? It is practical. You need somewhere safe. I have more space than I know what to do with. She laughed again, this time with genuine relief. Thank you. I promise I will not be any trouble. We will establish a few ground rules. I expected nothing less. By 7 that evening, my driver helped carry 2 suitcases, a canvas bag full of design samples, and one surprisingly healthy fiddle leaf fig into the elevator. When the doors opened directly into my apartment, Emily stopped walking. She slowly turned in a circle, taking in the glass walls, the skyline, the piano overlooking the river, and the quiet that always settled over the rooms after sunset. This place is incredible, she whispered. It is mostly just large, I replied. She looked at me with an expression that was impossible to read. No, she said gently. It feels like someone forgot to live here. Her words were not cruel. They were honest. Somehow that made them impossible to ignore. I handed her the key card to the guest suite before clearing my throat. 3 rules, I said. First, my work schedule stays unpredictable. Second, no unexpected guests without letting me know first. Third, if something is bothering you, tell me instead of pretending everything is fine. Emily smiled, balancing the key card between her fingers. I can agree to all 3. Then she tilted her head with the smallest hint of mischief. But I would like to add one of my own. I raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. She smiled a little wider. You have to let yourself come home sometimes, Claire. The first week passed so quietly that I almost convinced myself nothing had changed. That turned out to be the biggest lie I told myself all month. Emily had a way of filling empty spaces without making any noise. On Monday morning I walked into the kitchen expecting the usual silence, only to find fresh coffee already waiting beside my favorite mug. She had somehow guessed exactly how I took it, black with nothing added. Lucky guess, she said when I looked at her with obvious surprise. Or maybe I noticed you ignored the sugar every time we grabbed coffee years ago. I smiled before I realized I was smiling. It felt unfamiliar, like wearing an old jacket I had forgotten I owned. Every evening I came home expecting the apartment to feel exactly as it always had, but something small was different every single day. A bowl of lemons appeared on the kitchen island. A stack of architecture books was arranged neatly on the coffee table. Soft jazz replaced the complete silence that had always greeted me after work. None of it was expensive. None of it was dramatic. Somehow those tiny changes made a place worth millions finally feel lived in. Emily spent her days meeting clients, sketching layouts, and speaking with contractors from the dining table whenever she was not visiting construction sites. Sometimes I crossed the room carrying my laptop while she was surrounded by fabric samples and paint swatches. She would ask my opinion about a shade of blue or the placement of a reading chair, and I would pretend I knew absolutely nothing about interior design even though I secretly enjoyed watching her explain why every room deserved one object that made people smile. One evening I returned later than usual after a board meeting that seemed to last forever. My shoulders felt stiff, and my head still echoed with numbers and negotiations. As soon as I stepped inside, I caught the familiar scent of tomato soup and fresh bread. Emily looked up from the stove and smiled as though she had expected me at that exact moment. Long day? She asked. The longest. She filled a bowl before I could protest. Eat first. Billion-dollar decisions can wait another 20 minutes. I almost reminded her that they could not. Instead, I sat down without another word. We talked about everything except work. She told me about a couple arguing over kitchen cabinets as though the color of oak determined the future of their marriage. I laughed harder than the story deserved, mostly because she laughed first. After dinner she insisted on washing every dish despite my objections. I reached for the same plate she did, and our hands brushed for the briefest second. Neither of us pulled away immediately. It was not dramatic. It was not intentional. It was simply warm. Emily looked at me for a heartbeat longer than usual before quietly returning to the sink. I found myself thinking about that tiny moment during a conference call the following morning, which irritated me far more than it should have. I had spent years training my mind to ignore distractions, yet somehow the memory of one accidental touch refused to leave. 2 nights later I walked into the living room and found Emily asleep on the sofa with an open design magazine resting across her lap. One lamp remained on beside her, casting a soft glow across the room. She must have been waiting for me to come home. Without thinking, I picked up the magazine and carefully folded the blanket over her shoulders. She stirred slightly but did not wake. Just before I turned off the lamp, she whispered so quietly I almost missed it. "Welcome home, Claire." I stood there much longer than I should have, wondering why 2 ordinary words had somehow reached places inside me that years of success never could. By the beginning of the second week, I had quietly rearranged my entire schedule without admitting it even to myself. Meetings that normally stretched into the evening somehow ended before sunset. Business dinners became video calls. I even declined an invitation to a charity gala, something the old version of me would have considered impossible. Natalie noticed before I did. As she handed me my calendar one afternoon, she smiled with suspicious satisfaction. "You have been leaving the office earlier every day." I kept signing documents without looking up. Efficiency should not surprise you. Neither should happiness. I paused just long enough for her to notice. I did not say I was happy. You did not have to. I ignored the comment, but it followed me all the way home. The elevator doors opened, and instead of silence, I heard music drifting softly from somewhere deeper inside the apartment. Emily was standing barefoot in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove while quietly singing to herself. She did not notice me immediately. She looked completely at ease, as though she belonged there. I stood watching for several seconds before clearing my throat. She turned with an embarrassed laugh. "I did not hear you come in." "Apparently not." She pointed toward the dining table where 2 bowls were already waiting. "I tried a new soup recipe." "I hope billionaires eat vegetables." "Occasionally." She rolled her eyes. "Good. Tonight you are going to pretend to be a normal person for at least 30 minutes. During dinner we talked about everything except business. Emily described a renovation project for an elderly couple who could not agree where to place a bookshelf because each insisted the other deserved the better reading light. She told the story with so much warmth that I found myself laughing before I realized how ridiculous the situation actually was. "You know," she said after a while, "you laugh differently now." "I have different laughs?" "The one you used at the beginning sounded polite." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "This one reaches your eyes." I had no answer for that. Later that evening I noticed the light beneath a door that had remained closed for years. Emily stood in the hallway holding a sketchbook, looking uncertain. "I am sorry," she said quickly. The door was already open a little. I was not trying to snoop. I looked past her into the room. Dust covered the grand piano near the windows. Framed photographs still rested exactly where I had left them after my mother passed away. I had not stepped inside that room in almost 4 years. "I used to play," I said quietly. Emily looked around with gentle curiosity rather than pity. "What made you stop?" Life became louder than music. She walked only a few steps inside before stopping beside the piano. Her fingertips brushed the polished wood without pressing a single key. "I think music waits," she whispered. "It does not leave just because people get busy." Something tightened in my chest. Before I could stop myself, I sat on the piano bench and carefully lifted the cover from the keys. My fingers hesitated above them, stiff from years of neglect. The first notes came out uneven and uncertain. I frowned immediately. I have forgotten too much. Emily stepped closer until I could sense her beside me. Without saying anything, she placed one comforting hand lightly over mine. "No," she said softly. "Your hands remember. You just forgot to trust them." I looked up, and for one suspended heartbeat neither of us spoke. The city lights shimmered through the glass behind her, but I barely noticed them anymore because for the first time in years, someone had looked at me without seeing a billionaire, a chief executive officer, or a headline. She was simply looking at Claire, and that realization frightened me far more than any boardroom ever had. The days that followed blurred together in a way I had never experienced before. My calendar remained full, my phone never stopped ringing, and billion-dollar decisions still waited for my signature every morning. Yet my thoughts kept drifting back to the quiet apartment overlooking the Hudson River and the woman who somehow managed to make that enormous space feel smaller in the best possible way. I told myself it was gratitude. She had simply reminded me that life existed outside quarterly reports and shareholder meetings. Nothing more. At least that was the story I repeated every time my mind wandered toward her smile. Then Daniel Mercer appeared. I came home one Friday evening to find a man standing near the kitchen island holding a bouquet of white lilies. Emily looked uncomfortable the moment our eyes met. She immediately stepped forward. "Claire, this is Daniel." I recognized the name before she finished introducing him. Her former fiancé. Daniel extended his hand politely. "Thank you for letting Emily stay here. I appreciate everything you have done for her." I shook his hand with practiced professionalism. "She is welcome for as long as she needs." There was nothing outwardly wrong with him. He was well-dressed, confident, and friendly enough. The kind of man everyone expected someone like Emily to fall in love with. While they talked, I excused myself to my office under the excuse of finishing a presentation for Monday's board meeting. The truth was much simpler. I suddenly felt like a guest inside my own home. Through the partially open office door I could hear fragments of their conversation followed by soft laughter. I stared at the financial projections on my computer screen for nearly 20 minutes without reading a single number. That had never happened before. Eventually Daniel left, thanking both of us again before disappearing into the elevator. The apartment became quiet once more, but the silence felt completely different now. Emily knocked gently on my office door. "Do you have a minute?" I closed my laptop. "Of course." She stepped inside and sat across from me. "He asked if I would have dinner with him tomorrow." I nodded, pretending the information meant nothing. "And?" "I told him I would think about it." "That sounds reasonable." Emily watched me carefully, almost as if she expected a different response. "Is that really all you have to say?" I folded my hands together to keep them perfectly still. "Your personal life is your decision, Emily." She looked down for a moment before giving a small, disappointed smile. "You really are impossible to read." After she left, I remained in my office long after midnight. I tried convincing myself that her answer should not matter to me. She had every right to rebuild the future she once imagined. If Daniel had changed, perhaps they deserved another chance. That thought should have brought me peace. Instead it settled in my chest like a weight I could not explain. The following evening I attended a charity fundraiser that had been scheduled months earlier. Halfway through the reception, one of the investors introduced me to a successful entrepreneur named Victoria Collins. She was charming, intelligent, and perfectly pleasant. We spent several minutes discussing philanthropy before I noticed movement near the ballroom entrance. Emily had arrived unexpectedly to deliver a portfolio I had forgotten at home. She stopped the instant she saw Victoria laughing beside me. For the briefest moment, something crossed Emily's face before she quickly replaced it with a polite smile. It disappeared so fast that anyone else would have missed it. I did not. As she handed me the portfolio, our fingers brushed again, and she quietly said, "I hope I am not interrupting." I looked into her eyes and answered more honestly than I intended. "You never do." Emily stayed unusually quiet after the fundraiser. During the drive home, she looked out the window while the lights of Manhattan slipped across the glass like reflections neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I kept both hands on the steering wheel even though my driver had offered to take us home earlier. For reasons I could not explain, I wanted those extra 20 minutes alone with her, even if we barely spoke. When we finally reached the penthouse, she placed the portfolio on the kitchen counter and forced a small smile. "Victoria seems nice." "She is." The answer sounded colder than I intended. Emily nodded once. "I hope your meeting went well." "It was not a meeting." She looked at me for a second before quietly saying, "Right." She disappeared into the guest suite, leaving me alone with an uncomfortable feeling that had nothing to do with work. The next morning the weather changed without warning. Heavy rain swept across the city, and by late afternoon strong winds rattled the windows overlooking the river. I finished a conference call just as every light inside the apartment suddenly went dark. The silence that followed felt almost surreal before the backup emergency lights softly illuminated the hallway. "Claire?" Emily called from the living room. "I am here." She walked toward me carrying 2 candles she had already found in one of the kitchen drawers. "Good thing your assistant labels everything." I laughed quietly. Natalie plans for disasters better than most governments. Emily lit the candles and placed them on the coffee table. Warm light replaced the bright perfection of recessed fixtures, softening every corner of the apartment. Outside, rain traced silver lines across the enormous windows while thunder rolled somewhere far above the skyline. "Well," she said with a grin, "I guess neither of us has an excuse to answer emails tonight." We settled onto opposite ends of the sofa with bowls of leftover soup warmed on the gas stove. Without televisions, laptops, or phones competing for attention, conversation came surprisingly easily. Emily told me stories about her childhood in Vermont, where power outages had been ordinary during winter storms. I admitted that I had not experienced one in years because every office building I owned had industrial generators. "That explains a lot," she teased. "You are prepared for everything except ordinary life." I smiled into my bowl. "That is probably fair." The rain continued tapping gently against the glass. After dinner, Emily tucked one leg beneath herself and looked at me with unusual seriousness. "Can I ask you something?" "You usually do." "Have you ever regretted choosing work first?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I watched the candlelight flicker across the room that no longer felt as empty as it once had. "Not until recently," I admitted. Emily lowered her eyes. "Daniel always said I cared too much about everyone else. He thought love meant following the plan we made years ago." She sighed softly. "I kept trying to become the version of myself that fit our future instead of asking whether it still fit me." I turned toward her completely. "And does it?" She slowly shook her head. "I honestly do not know anymore." The honesty in her voice settled between us with surprising weight. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. The apartment seemed impossibly quiet except for the rain and the faint crackle of candlelight. Emily reached for her mug at exactly the same moment I reached to move one of the candles away from the edge of the table. Our hands met again, lingering naturally instead of pulling apart. She looked into my eyes, and for a heartbeat the rest of the world disappeared. I felt myself leaning forward almost without thinking before I caught my own reflection in the dark window behind her. I gently withdrew my hand and whispered, "Some moments deserve certainty, Emily." I would never want either of us to mistake loneliness for something bigger. She held my gaze a second longer before offering a quiet smile that somehow carried both gratitude and disappointment. "You really do think about everything," she whispered. I wished, for the first time in many years, that I did not. I barely slept after the storm. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily sitting across from me in the candlelight, looking at me with that quiet honesty that always seemed to dismantle every wall I had spent years building. By sunrise I had already answered 30 emails, reviewed 2 international contracts, and convinced myself I had everything under control again. Then I walked into the kitchen and found Emily humming softly while making pancakes, wearing one of my oversized sweaters because she claimed it was warmer than hers. She looked up and smiled as though nothing extraordinary had happened the night before. "Good morning," she said. "I figured even billionaires deserve breakfast on Saturdays." I accepted the cup of coffee she handed me, noticing she had prepared it exactly the way I liked without asking. "You are making this arrangement dangerously comfortable," I admitted. "Maybe comfortable is not dangerous." She leaned against the counter. "Maybe people just think it is because they are not used to it." Before I could answer, her phone vibrated. The smile on her face faded slightly when she saw the screen. "Daniel," she murmured almost to herself. She let the call ring until it stopped, then quietly placed the phone face down. "You did not answer," I observed. Emily shook her head. "I keep thinking I owe him another conversation because we spent so many years planning a future together." She paused before meeting my eyes. "But every time I am about to call him back, something inside me tells me it would be dishonest." My heartbeat became unexpectedly loud. "Dishonest to him?" She hesitated long enough that I almost wished I had never asked. "To both of us." Neither of us spoke again until later that evening. I retreated to my office, pretending to finish reports that no longer required my attention. Around 2 o'clock in the morning I heard a gentle knock on the partially open door. Emily stood there barefoot, holding a mug of chamomile tea with both hands. The hallway light framed her in a soft golden glow. "I hope I am not interrupting." I looked at the untouched documents covering my desk. "You are not." She stepped inside and closed the door behind her with surprising care. For a moment she simply stood there, taking a slow breath as though searching for the right words. Then she smiled nervously, exactly as she had in the memory that had haunted me since the beginning of all this. "Can I ask you something crazy?" My pulse stumbled. Those 7 words carried more weight than any legal contract I had ever signed. I set my glasses on the desk and gave her my full attention. "You can ask me anything." She looked down into her tea before speaking again. "When Daniel proposed, everyone told me I looked happier than they had ever seen me." She lifted her eyes to mine. "The strange thing is, I think they were seeing relief, not happiness." I remained silent because I knew she was not finished. "I have been trying to understand why everything feels different now." She swallowed carefully. "When you come home, I notice it before I hear the elevator. When you laugh, I catch myself smiling before I even know what was funny. And when I saw you standing beside Victoria," she stopped and laughed softly at herself. "I was jealous." My breath caught before she whispered the words that changed everything. "Not because I wanted what she had. Because I realized I wanted to be the person standing beside you." I stood slowly, leaving the desk between us because it was the only thing keeping my carefully controlled world from collapsing all at once. "Emily," I said quietly, "feelings discovered during uncertain seasons deserve patience." She nodded, tears shining but never falling. "I know." Then she took one small step closer and asked in almost a whisper, "What if this is the first thing in my life that has ever felt completely certain?" For several seconds neither of us moved. The city beyond the windows continued glowing as if millions of lives were unfolding without interruption, while inside my office time itself seemed unwilling to continue. Emily's question lingered between us with a quiet certainty that no boardroom negotiation had ever possessed. I searched for the perfect response, but every carefully rehearsed instinct that had protected me for years suddenly felt useless. "Emily," I said gently, "I believe you. That is exactly why I cannot answer you tonight." Confusion flickered across her face. "Because I was engaged?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Because you deserve the chance to discover who you are without feeling like I influenced the answer. If we cross that line now, I will spend the rest of my life wondering whether you chose me or whether I simply arrived while your world was falling apart." She lowered her eyes for a moment before giving the smallest smile. You always think 5 steps ahead. It is how I survived. She looked back at me. Maybe surviving is not the same thing as living. Before I could answer, both of our phones vibrated almost simultaneously. Mine continued ringing before I even reached it. Natalie's name filled the screen. I answered immediately. "Claire, do not open social media until I explain," she said, sounding more serious than I had heard in years. "What happened?" "Someone photographed you leaving the charity gala with Emily 2 nights ago. Another picture shows her entering your building yesterday afternoon. Several entertainment sites have already published stories claiming you have a secret relationship with the woman living in your penthouse." I closed my eyes briefly. How widespread? It is spreading quickly because they identified Emily by matching her design firm's website. I looked toward Emily, who was reading messages on her own phone. The color slowly disappeared from her face. "Claire," she whispered, "my clients are asking questions." Within an hour my communications team filled the living room with conference calls, legal advice, and recommendations about controlling the narrative before financial markets opened Monday morning. Emily quietly remained in the kitchen, giving everyone space even though the headlines were about her as much as me. Every few minutes I caught myself looking toward her, wishing I could walk across the room and tell her none of this mattered. Unfortunately, the world I had built rarely allowed simple truths. Just before dawn the chairman of my board called. His voice was polite but unmistakably cautious. "Claire, investors dislike uncertainty. We need a clear statement before the market opens." I already knew what he expected. When the call ended, I stood alone on the balcony overlooking the river. Emily quietly joined me a few moments later, wrapping a light sweater around her shoulders against the cool morning air. "You have to protect the company," she said before I spoke. "That is your responsibility." I looked at her with more regret than I had ever allowed myself to show anyone. Some responsibilities cost more than others. She offered a sad but understanding smile. "Then do what you need to do." 2 hours later I stood behind a podium in the lobby of corporate headquarters facing dozens of cameras. My prepared statement was short, professional, and painfully incomplete. I explained that Emily was a longtime family friend temporarily staying in my home because of unexpected housing repairs and that recent speculation about our personal lives was inaccurate. The questions continued, but I answered none of them. When I returned to the penthouse that evening, the apartment felt colder than it had the day Emily first arrived. Her suitcases were standing beside the front door. She met my eyes with quiet composure. "I know why you said what you did," she whispered. "But knowing does not stop it from hurting." Before I could find the words I should have spoken much earlier, the elevator doors closed behind her, and for the first time since she entered my life, the silence inside my home sounded exactly the way it used to. The following morning I walked into the boardroom expecting another battle over stock prices, public perception, and shareholder confidence. Instead, I found myself unable to focus on a single financial report because every empty space in my mind had been filled by Emily's absence. The coffee tasted the same, the presentations followed their usual rhythm, and every executive around the table behaved exactly as they always had. Nothing had changed except the one thing that actually mattered. Halfway through the meeting, Natalie quietly placed a folder beside my laptop. "This arrived 20 minutes ago," she whispered. Inside was a report from our cybersecurity team. The photographs that had reached the media had not come from random paparazzi after all. Security footage showed that someone had accessed private camera feeds connected to a neighboring building before anonymously distributing carefully selected images to multiple entertainment websites. This had not been chance. It had been planned. My chief legal officer immediately began discussing investigations and liability, but I barely heard another word. All I could think about was Emily leaving my apartment believing I had chosen my company over her. The meeting ended 2 hours later. Instead of returning to my office, I walked directly outside, canceled every appointment on my calendar, and asked my driver to take me somewhere I had never imagined choosing over work. Emily had returned to the small temporary apartment her insurance company had arranged while her building renovations were being completed. She answered the door wearing comfortable jeans, a cream-colored sweater, and an expression of quiet surprise. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I held out the folder. "I owe you the truth." She invited me inside without a word. I explained everything, from the security breach to the board's pressure and my decision to protect the company by sacrificing the one person I wanted to protect most. When I finished, silence settled gently between us. Emily looked down at the folder before asking the question I had been asking myself for days. "If none of that had happened, would your answer have been different?" I smiled sadly. My answer changed long before the headlines did. My courage did not. She studied my face carefully, as though searching for the woman hidden beneath every polished interview and carefully measured public statement. "Why are you here today?" she asked. I took a slow breath. Because I finally realized I spent my entire life building a place where everyone admired me but almost nobody truly knew me. Then you walked into my apartment with 2 suitcases, a houseplant, and enough kindness to make it feel like a home. I told myself I was protecting you. The truth is I was protecting the version of myself that never had to risk being vulnerable. Emily's eyes shimmered with emotion, but she smiled anyway. "That sounds much more like Claire than Chief Executive Officer Bennett." I laughed softly. "I hope so." She stepped closer until only a comfortable silence remained between us. "I am still figuring out who I am," she admitted. "I cannot promise I have every answer today." "You do not have to," I replied. "I do not need certainty anymore. I only need honesty." She reached for my hand, and this time neither of us hesitated. The gesture felt quiet, natural, and wonderfully ordinary. As we stood together by the window overlooking the city, I realized love had never arrived with dramatic speeches or perfect timing. It had arrived through shared breakfasts, late-night conversations, forgotten music, rainy evenings, and one unforgettable question that forced both of us to stop living the lives everyone expected and finally choose the lives that felt true. A week later Emily returned to the penthouse carrying the same fiddle-leaf fig she had brought on her first day. She placed it beside the living room window, looked around with a warm smile, and said, "I think this place has finally become a home." This time, when I looked around, I knew she was right.